Hi, this is David Armstrong. I'm here with another edition of our Musical Theater Factory blog, and today we're talking to Albert Evans, who wears many hats at the Fifth Avenue Theater, both literally and figuratively. And tell us a little bit about what you do here at the Fifth Avenue.
I am Artistic and Music Associate, which I think of as a big box you can throw about any job in. I write for the magazine, I write articles, I do dramaturgy, which is essentially...
Dramaturgy may be a word that people don't know.
Yeah. It's essentially researching the history of a show, or in the case of Cinderella, the story of Cinderella, and bringing relevant material to the director and to the actors just to sort of enhance their understanding of the material. And it also sometimes involves advocating for the authors, in this case Rodgers and Hammerstein, and being sure that their work is presented in its best light and in a historically accurate light.
So tell us a little bit about the story of Cinderella, because you did quite a bit of research on that, and it's a fascinating thing because I think more research leads to more research. You can go on and on with studying the story.
Yeah, it seemed to be endless, the Cinderella story. It's really one of the oldest folk tales in the world. It's over 2,000 years old. The earliest extant written version of Cinderella is from China about 2,000 years ago. And it still has the familiar elements of the well-born girl who's reduced to the status of a slave in the house of her stepmother, and a spirit helper who comes and grants her wish, in this case in the form of a giant fish. It's very, very interesting. It's essentially the spirit of her mother returns as a giant fish who crawls up on the riverbank, and they sort of cuddle together and comforts Cinderella in some way. And then her stepmother finds out, catches the giant fish, boils it, and they eat it for dinner, which, unbeknownst to Cinderella. But then the bones have magical powers, and that's what grants the wish. But it's recognizable as Cinderella.
And she ends up marrying the king.
She ends up marrying the king. In this case, it's some sort of local warlord.
Mm-hmm. And the shogun or something like that. So we're in China, so it's not a shogun.
Not a shogun, but and she is the daughter of a cave master, whatever that may be, but it's some sort of local potentate who rules the cave people around.
So is there any sense of how that story from 2,000 years ago in China then spread? Because obviously that's the story. It's not. I don't think that story is coincidentally they came up with the same story somewhere else. Somehow that story had to have spread, or do you think it was multiple versions of just the same idea?
There are so many very similarities that are hard to believe that it's coincidence. Every country, every culture in the world has its own Cinderella story. And so you've got to believe that somehow it got around. I don't know, through trade routes or, whatever. But it kept on going. In the Philippines, the fairy godmother is a giant crab. In some cultures, she's a willow tree. In Russia, she's a little red calf. But there's always that same character.
And the most famous versions that we would be familiar with in the United States come from where?
Well, it was finally put down in the written form that we basically know it as by Charles Perrault in the 17th century, a French author. And at that time, there was a craze in the court for writing literary fairy tales. This was something the ladies of the court would do to pass the time. And they would gather in literary salons, and they would read their latest fairy stories. He decided that he would write his own based on folk tales and publish them. So he published a book of fairy stories that include several of the ones that we know now.
And that's the Tales of Mother Goose.
The Tales of Mother Goose, yeah. And so, but his is a very elegant, court-based version. Everyone's very sort of polite, and she ends up forgiving the stepsisters in the end. And whereas 2 centuries later, when the Brothers Grimm collected their Germanic version, it's like the stepmothers come to a very bad end. Birds peck out their eyes, and they're, And
of course, that's the version that Sondheim used in Into
the Woods. Yeah, that's the one we know. But most adapters will go more with the French version because it's a little more family-friendly.
Right.
It's not quite so violent.
So, and that's what inspired the Disney movie that most people have seen and grew up with, and the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical.
Exactly. Yeah, when Rodgers and Hammerstein had the opportunity to write an original musical for television, this was in the 50s, and Mary Martin had a huge success a couple of years before with Peter Pan, which had been a Broadway musical, but really was seen by most people as a live television broadcast. And CBS came to Rodgers and Hammerstein and said, we want you to do an original musical for television. And they're the ones who came up with the idea of Cinderella.
And do we have any sense of how they chose that or why they chose that?
Well, I tend to think the other thing Cinderella had, CBS had, besides the money, was Julie Andrews.
They had already signed her to do whatever.
They had signed her to do whatever the project. And when you and she was doing My Fair Lady on Broadway at the same time. And when you think about it, My Fair Lady is a Cinderella story.
That's true.
And so that might have put the idea in their head.
They saw her as Cinderella because they just seen her.
Smudgy and, the little gutter snipe who becomes a great lady at the ball. And it seems sort of natural.
No, that is interesting. Yeah. They probably just influenced, whether either subconsciously or consciously, they thought Cinderella, Julie Andrews.
That's how she had become famous and known to the entire country. She'd been on Life magazine and television programs, and she just seemed like the natural
embodiment
princess
of Cinderella.
And she had that accent.
Great. Too. So is there anything about this version that we're doing here at the Fifth Avenue that is different from the original story? What are the elements that have been either that Rodgers Hammerstein brought to it or these adapters of the Rodgers Hammerstein have done?
Well, the original television broadcast was 90 minutes long. It was live, and it had commercials. So it's not really long enough for a musical. So when people got the idea to adapt this as a stage musical, obviously material had to be added. And what they did was they started cherry-picking the less successful Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, like Me and Juliet, Pipe Dream, Allegro.
Some of which had great songs.
They had great songs.
Songs that had nowhere to be, basically, because those shows weren't being performed.
And they never really entered the repertory the way that the 5 big Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals did. So people didn't know them, and this was a chance to use some of these songs, and they fit right in. And then as things progressed over the years, every stage production of Cinderella seemed to have a different song list.
In terms of these extra added songs.
They would add new songs, and people would rewrite the script. But again, the great thing about Cinderella is it's such a strong basic story that as long as you tell that story, you can't go far wrong. You can embellish it however you want.
Great. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a future blog entry. Thanks, Albert, for being us, and we'll see you guys next time at the Musical Theater Factory.